Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, dear ministers, dear panelists. First of all, let me start by saying it's really a great honor to be here at the first council meeting on aging, and like my other panelists, I'd like to congratulate the Republic of Turkey as well as the Ministry of Family, Labor and Social Affairs for embarking on such an excellent initiative and taking this important topic forward in the country. The OECD has been working in the area of employment and aging for over 2 decades. And as we've heard before, that employment is a fundamental part of active aging. And what I would like to do today in my presentation is, is to share some of the key challenges that are associated with population aging, but also some of the lessons that we've learned over these years on what countries have done, some of the policy mistakes, but some of the policy solutions to encourage and strengthen employment opportunities for older workers. So let me begin by saying that population aging is a global phenomenon, and we've heard this before by previous speakers. And although age structures vary substantially across OECD countries today, what we're going to expect is that populations everywhere will become significantly older over the coming decades. In this chart, what you will see is that population aging has already pushed the median age above 40 in some of the high-income OECD countries. This is most evident in countries like Japan, Italy, Spain, and Germany, where half of the population is already older than 43. These countries will become significantly older over the next 30 years. But the pace of population aging will also be dramatic in some non-OECD countries. For instance, half of the population in China is projected to be older than 50 by 2050. Now, in comparison to these countries, Turkey remains a relatively young country, where half of the population is only around 30-year-old. But by 2050, the median age in Turkey will also become similar to those of European countries. So Turkey is going to look much more like countries like Germany and Italy today. And without determined and sustained efforts to improve the labor market situation of older individuals, population aging can act as a drag on living standards for everybody, create higher tax burdens, but also increase the risk of old age poverty. Now, in this chart, what you have is the number of retirees per worker today, but also in 2050. What it shows is that if labor force entry and exit patterns by age and gender remain unchanged, meaning if nothing is done in terms of employment and social policies to improve the labor market situation for older people, the average number of retirees will increase from 43 workers per 100 workers in 2019 to almost 60 in 2050. Now, if countries, including Turkey, were to do a lot more to improve and give better opportunities for work to older workers, this increase could be slowed considerably to 50 retirees per workers. That's in 2050. So, what is the labor force participation or employment looking like of older workers across the OECD? The good news is that the labor force participation rates of 55 to 64-year-olds have risen remarkably in high-income countries, but also some of the upper-middle income countries over the past decades. These gains have been most notable where participation rates were already very high, for example, in Japan, Korea, Germany, and the UK, as well as several countries where old age participation remains considerably lower, for example, in Italy, France, and Turkey. Now, despite these mostly positive developments in the employment area, what we see is there are very considerably large differences in country performance. And this highlights the diverse range of challenges and the policy response responses that are needed to meet the challenges related to population aging. For example, in many countries like Japan and Germany, participation rates for 55 to 64-year-olds are already very high. So in these countries, policies need to focus on how we can strengthen employment opportunities for people even beyond the age of 65. Now, in some other countries, including Turkey, where you have large cohorts of youth population, the challenge is not only to improve the employment for older workers, but also to bring the younger populations into the labor force, to ensure that they have sufficient labor market experience and good working conditions to be able to age in a good condition later on. So overall, raising participation rates of older people, in fact, will not be sufficient to meet the challenges of population aging, and a comprehensive strategy is needed to strengthen work attachments across all different groups. And indeed, what we see is that labor's resources in many countries are not used to their full capacity, and there is still scope to mobilize untapped sources of employment, including women, people with disabilities, and youth. The large gap in participation rates among prime age workers, i.e. those of 25 to 54-year-olds, in a number of countries suggests that these countries can do more to promote participation of women in paid work. And similarly, in the second panel, panel B, we see that the proportion of young people that are at risk of being excluded from work and study, which we call NEET, the proportion of young people not in employment, education, and training remains stubbornly high, including in Turkey, as in some of the other upper income OECD countries. Now let me move to the second part of the presentation, which is what can we do and how can we in fact improve and strengthen employment opportunities for older workers. In 2015, the OECD ministers approved the OECD recommendation on aging and employment policies, and what this recommendation provides is an action plan or a age-friendly policy agenda on 3 key areas where countries need to do a lot more in order to give fulfilling and rewarding working lives to older workers. And these include 3 areas. What I would like to do is focus on the 2 areas on encouraging employers to retain and hire older workers and promoting employability. I'm leaving out rewarding work and later retirement simply because, in fact, in a lot of the OECD countries, large parts of action has already been taken in this area, which involves increasing the retirement age and also extending or reforming old age pension systems. But countries have done much less to encourage employers to retain and hire workers and promote their employability. So what have we learned, and what still needs to be done, and what countries are doing about this? So in the area of encouraging employers to retain and hire older workers, what we've seen is that tackling age discrimination is absolutely critical, and that's because we've seen over and over again at the workplaces, older workers are consistently discriminated against when it comes to hiring, being given opportunities to training, or retaining them up until their retirement ages. Now, legislation is in place in many of the EU countries that prohibits age discrimination, but the implementation is uneven. And many countries are also trying to implement awareness through raising campaigns, and a few countries are implementing concrete measures to limit discriminatory practices. One of the really good examples that we've seen recently in this area is, in fact, from France, where the Public Employment Services uses an aptitude test when it comes to hire older workers, which means that you refer older people to jobs based on their results, on their aptitudes, rather than their age or previous work experience. The second area that still needs to be tackled is aligning wages with productivity. Again, in many OECD countries, older workers are often paid according to their age and not, in fact, to their productivity, which which hinders their employability. Often employers don't hire older workers because they feel they will need to pay them a lot more or above their productivity levels. Here in Finland, for example, the public sector has been a great example to the private sector by aligning the wages of older workers with their performance and their productivity levels rather than their age. The third area in this topic is improving age management advice. Career guidance and counseling for employers and workers can reduce negative stereotypes of older workers, and especially they can stimulate older employees to work on their own employability, to learn new skills and transfer experience. In this regard, the Austrian Public Employment Service has been providing a counseling program for employers with special emphasis on the development of a life cycle-oriented educational programs. Similarly, in Finland, key guidelines are provided to human resource staff and line managers when it comes to training and employability of older workers. The second important pillar to improve labor market opportunities is, in fact, facilitating labor mobility. And what I mean by that is that often we see that older workers become unemployed or become long-term unemployed much before they reach their mandatory retirement ages. So in order to bring them back into the labor market or connect them back to jobs, it's important that the public employment services gives adequate support to this group and not only some of the other disadvantaged groups, including youth. What we've seen in this area is that evaluations have shown very positive results when you combine peer group learning, job search training, coaching, and individual counseling. That works the best for older workers when it comes to helping them connect with jobs. In Germany, for example, there's an intensive counseling program for the older unemployed between the age of 50 and over. Similarly, in Lithuania, there's a system of providing integrated services to the long-term unemployed among many who are older workers. The second area that needs to be improved is assistance to become self-employed. A number of countries in the EU are promoting or facilitating self-employment for older workers. It is more likely to be successful if individuals are offered this option early on in the unemployment period and not as a last chance after a long period of unsuccessful job search. Now, a lot of my panelists have emphasized the importance of life course perspective, and I like to emphasize that too in my presentation, especially when it comes to improving labor market situation of older workers. Training of all workers, including those approaching the end of their careers, is absolutely critical, and training throughout their working lives. Here, what we see in countries, often there is a focus on providing vocational education training to younger people, but not to older workers, because they feel they're going to be soon retiring, and so therefore it's not worth investing in these people anymore. But again, we see a turnaround in attitudes in country, in policy making towards that. Again, in Germany, the Public Employment Services provides targeted subsidies to small and medium employers to help them promote training of low-skilled workers at the age of 45 and older. Improving digital skills is key as we see the future of work changing, and with technological change, more ICT skills would be needed. And for older workers, there's a particular risk that the skills they have are quickly becoming outdated. Here, we've seen in Greece and in the Netherlands, there's special programs that are targeted to help older people improve their digital skills. And while improving training is important, the other part that is equally important is the recognition of training. Often, older workers have very valuable experience in the labor market that goes unrecognized. There's no official way of actually recognizing or finding out the experience they have gained. So validated, acquired experience is absolutely crucial to help them move or transition from jobs to job. Again, in this area, we've seen in the Netherlands, there are some excellent programs how we can actually encourage employers to formally recognize the skills of older workers before they leave their companies. And similarly, in Portugal, there are really interesting initiatives on education and training and the recognition of skills for older workers. Finally, let me come to another important part of the life course perspective, which is promoting better job quality. It's not all about the quantity of jobs that we produce, but also the quality of jobs that we produce. And it's particularly for older workers, it's important that they have good quality jobs, they are in good health, to ensure that they in fact can stay in the labor market as their capacities allow. Now, several EU countries are implementing measures in a preventative way through toolkits and guidance material that can detect remaining work capacities and propose vocational rehabilitation programs. Let me offer you some good practices in this area. For example, in Belgium, the Occupational Experience Fund financially supports companies for projects intending to improve the quality of jobs, specifically for workers 45 and older. In Austria, the Fit to Work program is providing national-wide low-threshold counseling services involving sort of raising awareness for health-friendly working environments, reducing sick leave among older workers, and premature exits from the labor market. Equally important in the area of job quality is the combining work and care. Now, care responsibility for older parents is an important employment barrier, and a few countries have developed actions to help workers combine care and work responsibilities more easily. For example, under the European Pillar of Social Rights, there's a new proposal that gives employees or grants employees 5 days of carers' leave in a year in the case of sickness of relatives. And in the United Kingdom, a right of flexible working for carers has been introduced since 2014, and in Lithuania, carers have a right to unpaid leave. So these were some of the examples and flavors to encourage or what needs to be done in the area of employment, and specifically to ensure that older workers have access to gainful employment, but to stay in there as long as possible and in a healthy and a productive manner. And I think I'll conclude by saying that we have a lot of material and access to data in terms of employment rates, which I highly encourage to a lot of, which is useful to governments, but also highly encourage the NGOs and the civil society to use these data that can influence the policy domain in this area. So there's a lot of information on the website here, and I'm happy to talk to you afterwards. Thank you very much.